Let me introduce Ian Hutchinson. As I said, he's Professor perhaps I didn't say, he's Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering from MIT in the States. He's come across just to give this, for which we're very grateful. He's not a stranger to Cambridge. He did an MA, a bachelor's and master's here first, and then he went to one of our dominions in Australia for a PhD. His interest is in plasma physics, and he's written books on that. And he runs a machine which gets temperatures, I've read, reaching 50 million degrees Celsius, which sounds a bit warm for me. Even for a geologist, when I tell people molten rock comes out at 1,300 degrees, I think, wow, that's hot. But I think 50 million really is hot. So one day, I guess we'll all be getting our electricity from fusion reactors, hopefully, and you will have played your part in that, I presume. But that's not what he's talking about today, although he'll talk about physics as well. He wants to talk to us about scientism. How much faith should we put in science? And certainly that's an important question today, isn't it? When some people hold up science as the answer to everything, absolutely everything. Well, should we do that or not? Certainly in our culture, science holds a very high place. So let me invite you to come and talk to us. For that, there'll be a chance for questions at the end.
Thank you. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you also for being here and being a part of this discussion. How much faith should we put in science is the question. But first, what's scientism? Perhaps many of you are asking yourself that question. And I should perhaps tell you what scientism is. Scientism, in short, is the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. And I've written a book about it, and this is my shameless advert, called Monopolizing Knowledge. And the reason why I want to address this in the context of science and religion is because scientism is in many ways at the heart of many misunderstandings of the relationship between science and faith. And the purpose of my book is to try to set forth the history of scientism, how it grew and so forth, to what extent it's justified, and to draw a distinction between scientism and science, and also to show you the cultural consequences of scientism. And of course, I don't have to have time to touch on much out of my book, so I'll be skating over much of that lightly. But I hope that those of you who want to go deeper will be inspired by what I have to say. So, when I approach this question of scientism, and I explain that scientism is the claim that science is all the real knowledge there is, there are two types of reactions. One is to say, well, that's obviously true, and the other reaction is to say, well, it's obviously false. Well, with those two reactions, there's clearly something going on here that is not completely understood. Those of you who might have the reaction, well, that's obviously untrue, might think that I'm setting up some kind of straw man that I'm going to knock down. So I just wanted to point out that scientism is extremely widespread in our society today. And here are a couple of quotes. Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, on approximately six different times in his book, makes the assertion of this type. The existence of God is a scientific hypothesis like any other. Another recent book by someone called Paul Fagard, he says, what is reality? Those things and processes that identified by well-established fields of science using theories backed by evidence drawn from systematic observations and experiments. In other words, he's saying all of reality is what we discover by science. And actually, the clearest example of very explicit scientism is an even more recent book by this philosopher, Alex Rosenberg, from Duke University. He uses the word scientism, which is rather rare, actually. It's rare for those who espouse scientism to use that word. And he says this is the conviction that the methods of science are the only reliable ways to secure knowledge of anything. In other words, he's using my definition. And he says science provides all the significant truths about reality. And in case you hadn't quite got it, he then says, once you adopt science, you also be able to cease treating the humanities as knowledge. So, So there is explicit scientism out there, but it's far more often a kind of implicit ethos of intellectual conversation to which attention is not directly drawn, and yet it's still very often there. Now, one of the reasons that scientism is able to survive and to prosper in this under-the-radar kind of way is a confusion about what science is. So let me just draw your attention to this particular type of confusion. In other words, what is science? Well, one way to approach the question of what is science is to simply say, well, what's the Latin derivation of the word science? The answer is scientia, and if that were all we meant by science, then science would simply mean knowledge. And long ago, hundreds of years ago, that really was its main meaning, although even then, natural science was the paradigm that was often alluded to. So if you read the Encyclopédie of Diderot, one of the sort of founding documents of the Enlightenment, science is basically defined as any kind of philosophical concept, provided it's demonstrated by systematic demonstration. And if you were to go 100 years later and read the historian Thomas Macaulay, he also uses science, he refers to it on one occasion as the growth of the human mind, in the most general terms. But then, of course, he tends to give as his examples of what science is, the things which are the natural sciences. Even as late as the mid-20th century, R.G. Collingwood, in a book that was entirely intended to criticize scientism, still uses the word science as any body of systematic knowledge or orderly thinking. Now, if this were the definition of what we meant by science, then in a certain sense, scientism is essentially a tautology. Because if science just means knowledge, well then clearly science is all the knowledge there is. And so it's simply tautological. But that isn't what we mostly mean by science today. These historical usages have been replaced by and large in our thinking, in our language today, with what it used to be called natural philosophy, the study of nature, in other words, the natural sciences. And that's what I'm going to mean by the word science when I speak today, and I submit to you it's what most people mean when they talk about science, particularly when they talk about the relationship between science and faith. Because if we're talking about science and religion, we're not talking about reconciling the gods and goddesses of ancient mythology with the latest economic theory. No, we're talking about how to explore the compatibility of a major religion like Christianity with a modern understanding of physics or cosmology or physiology or biology and so on. And science and faith, or science and religion, is a burning issue for us today precisely because science, natural science, has this wonderful prestige, epistemological prestige, based on its amazing growth and success. And by the way, if we really did have that old-fashioned meaning that science was really just meant knowledge, then one could argue that theology would still be a science. Perhaps it wouldn't be their queen today, but it still would be a science. But today, science doesn't mean that. And therefore, in a certain very definite sense, theology is not a science. Now, just moving forward and trying to understand better what is science, one approach to understanding what science is to say that science is the study of nature. But I submit to you that that's not a very coherent way to define what we mean by science. And the reason is because the word nature is very far from being a clear and unambiguous word. Quite the contrary, this has been recognized for hundreds of years. Robert Boyle was one of the founders of the Royal Society and wrote a whole book which was entitled An Free Inquiry into the Vulgarly Received Notion of Nature. And in it he lists 8 possible different meanings of the word nature. And the whole thrust of that book is actually to depreciate the use of the word nature to mean the kind of Aristotelian approach to understanding nature, and to regard nature as the second cause of things. So the problem with regarding science as simply the study of nature is that it's not so obvious that we really quite know what we mean by nature. It's rather ill-defined. So science is actually better understood, not by studying its subjects, but rather by considering its methods. And the methods of science are studied in great depth by philosophers and historians, but I would like to suggest to you that we can boil down the methods of science and hence identify what we mean by natural science in the following way. We're very familiar with the distinctive characteristics and strategies which science uses. They're things like observation, experiment, measurement, systematization, mathematization, self-consistency, and so on. But I think those can all be boiled down really into two main headings. The first I call reproducibility. So in science we require the ability to make reproducible, repeatable observations or repeatable experiments. And the second characteristic, which I'm going to expand on both of these more, is what I refer to as clarity, and I'll use a capital C. It's a kind of technical use of the word clarity. And this is that we require in science unambiguous descriptions, the sorts of descriptions that we get from measurements. And we also proceed then to classification. And perhaps many people will think, especially in terms of mathematics, when we talk about science, which in many ways has the clearest sort of clarity. Now, these two characteristics, I submit, imply that science's scope is limited. It's constrained by its insistence upon reproducibility and clarity. Michael Faraday, a wonderful character in 19th century science in Britain, used to explain that he had a tremendously fertile imagination. He said he could imagine the Arabian Nights as soon as anything else. But he said, and this is the way he put it, he said, nevertheless, facts were important to me and saved me. He said, without experiment, I am nothing. And it was said of Michael Faraday that when he would read of some latest experimental result discovered by someone else, maybe communicated in a letter or a paper, the first thing that he would do is he would rush down to his lab in the Royal Institution in London. He would try to reproduce the effect that had been described to him, because he knew in his bones that repeatability was the heart of science. And I like to think that this woodcut of Faraday in his Royal Institution lab is him trying to reproduce some result of that he just heard about. Did that make him, reliance on repeatable, reproducible tests, did that make him an arch skeptic? Far from it. He was a lifelong Christian, and he was an elder in the Sandemanian church, of which he was a member. That meant that he was, to some extent, the pastor or the minister of that church for extended periods of his life. Now, one argument about this is, well, what about observational sciences? I mean, you've talked about experiments, but there are many sciences in which we can't do experiments. If you think about, let's say, astronomy, you can't do experiments on stars, change something and look and see how it behaves. But even in the observational sciences, reproducibility is also vital. On the 4th of July, 1054, Chinese astronomers saw a growing bright star in the sky. It grew to be brighter than the morning or evening star. And it was bright for some weeks or months, and it gradually faded away. And this was, of course, a supernova. Now, if that had been all we could say about that supernova, about that event, that bright starry event, science would be almost powerless to study. But that isn't all we can say about that observation. In the first place, many other supernovae also occur. And so now, with the telescopes we have, we can see supernovae on a practically routine basis throughout our galaxy. What's more, even from individual supernovae, such as the 1054, traces are left. And this, in fact, this is the Crab Nebula. This is the result of that supernova, that star that exploded back in 1054. And any telescope can view it now. And in fact, if you're, practically anybody with access to a halfway decent telescope can look and discover for themselves the presence of the Crab Nebula. And there are multiple phenomena associated with this. So that, for example, in the middle of the nebula, there's a pulsar that pulses radio waves on a regular basis. And if you care to keep track of the size of this nebula, as some undergraduate students from Dartmouth College did, you can see that it's actually expanding a little bit year by year. And if you track that expansion and you measure it, and then you imagine it played backwards, you find that this thing must have occurred sometime in the 11th century. Yes, of course, it was actually that supernova of history. So reproducibility is equally important in the observational sciences as it is in experimental or lab sciences. It's just not reproducibility at will. But there are many, many things in our lives and in our intellectual thoughts that are not reproducible. And I think history, to me, is the clearest example of an academic discipline in which it's not dealing with reproducibility. Only a tiny fraction of history's activities benefit from anything bearing the stamp of the methods of natural science. I mean, how do we know the truth of the statement that Julius Caesar was murdered on the steps of the Roman Senate in 44 BC, 15th of March? I mean, of course, we don't know that by science. We know it convincingly. This is a fact of history, but it's discoverable and it's established by methods that are very, very different from the methods that we expect to use in the natural sciences. So yes, history is real knowledge, it's just not scientific knowledge. Looking around the room, there are probably many of you here were alive when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and during that period, Milton Friedman, who's an economist, his theories, which were known as monetarist theories, were put into practice in the United Kingdom. This was often referred to by the press as the monetarist experiment. Now, was this a scientific experiment? I submit to you, no, it wasn't a scientific experiment, because it's not an experiment that could be done reproducibly. We're not going to go back and do over the monetarist experiment in Britain. And so I submit to you that economics, even though it's very often mathematical and very rigorous in many different ways, has a different character from the kind of character that we expect in the natural sciences. And of course, you can think about, for example, politics, where we exchange the consistency and the predictability that we expect in the natural sciences for, pragmatism and public opinion and so forth. And yet, we call it political science. That's perhaps a throwback to that old-fashioned meaning of the word science. So these are not sciences in the sense that natural sciences are. My colleagues at MIT sometimes get a little bit miffed and bristle when I say this. And there may be those of you in some of these other disciplines who are already bristling. But this is not my intention to criticize or belittle these disciplines by saying they are not sciences. Quite the opposite. My intention is to affirm that these disciplines have real knowledge. It simply isn't the same as scientific knowledge. I don't subscribe to scientism, the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. And yet, that belief, which is so much part of our intellectual ethos, and has been for 100 years or more, has had its effects in many ways in distorting their disciplines. And it's been criticized by many of their own experts. Let me say a few words about this requirement of clarity. This clarity in a specialized sense is a sort of foundational requirement in order that reproducibility can be expressed and tested. After all, unless we have a clear and unambiguous way of describing the results of an experiment, we aren't going to be able to tell whether, if that experiment is repeated, that we got the same answers. In fact, even the same experimenter won't necessarily be able to tell that they got the same result over again. So the results of any scientific investigation, even if not its interpretation, have to be expressed in terms that are unambiguous, that are understood by all the different investigators. And so the most characteristic way we get that clarity is by the process of measurement, turning observations into numbers. And that involves, of course, units, and this is a way of illustrating the importance of units, and a whole infrastructure of science has been built up so that we're able to pursue measurement, reducing nature to numbers. And mathematical expression is also another ideal, particularly of physical science. But I don't want to boil down this clarity into just mathematics. I think that would be a mistake, because there are fields like botany, in which, for example, certainly in the early stages, classification is just as important. And what's more, particularly in a field like botany, field skills are extremely important. And field skills are developed precisely to give the kinds of clarity we're seeking in the natural sciences, even though a mathematical description, and sometimes even a measurement description, is not necessarily the most important part. So these aren't really mathematical, and yet they are present and developed carefully by scientists in order to provide a degree of clarity. But there are many things in our world and in our lives which do not possess the kinds of clarity that we expect from the natural sciences. And here are a few examples. The beauty of a sunset, the justice of a verdict, the compassion of a nurse, the terror of a war, the excitement of a symphony, the love of a woman. These are topics which cannot meaningfully be ascribed the kind of clarity that is required by science. And in some cases, there may be scientific analyses of these types of topics. For example, if you take the sunset, for example, we can certainly do an analysis of what one sees in a sunset. We can explain why the sky turns red because of the scattering of photons, and we can understand the gradation of the colors through the sky, and we can give a mathematical or physical description of all of this thing in great detail. But when we've done that, well, we've sort of missed the point, haven't we? Because it's the beauty of the sunset that has been ignored in that scientific description. It's been omitted in that scientific description. So I want to illustrate this. I think music is a particularly helpful way of trying to understand the notion of clarity and the fact that so many of the important things that we learn and that we experience do not possess it. So, with luck, if this plays, I'm going to play you this clip, and the question is, what is this about? There may be some of you out there who know what that event is, okay? But here's one way of describing that event. We could describe that event, focusing perhaps on this young lady here, by saying that it is taking two pieces of molten copper. They are collided together. The electrons in the surfaces of the copper interact in such a way as to generate waves which propagate through that copper. It's actually a copper alloy, because it's got some zinc and other things in it. And as a result, give rise to vibrations in the air. That's one way of describing that event, a perfectly good way. Or you could say, focusing on this person, but describing it at a higher level, well, this is rather sort of a bit of engineering, okay? This is someone with a big hammer, and they're hammering on something at the back of this auditorium for some reason, okay? But of course, those descriptions, which are perfectly correct, they're not erroneous descriptions, they're true descriptions, are only a tiny part of what is really happening here. The music, which is, of course, as those of you who know, the famous hammer blow from Mahler's Sixth Symphony, the music is much more than that. and the music has a significance that is much more than that. Of course, it's a symphony orchestra as much as it is, pieces of brass being crashed together. And what's more, even the music itself is something whose meanings are not present in any kind of scientific or even perhaps directly within the musical notation. They're elicited by the very act of hearing, by the connection of that music to the human, and that's why they obviously, a musical event like this obviously doesn't possess the clarity of being able to be expressed unambiguously. And to make a long story short, you can't express ambiguity unambiguously. Now, another aspect of science which springs from these two, and I would say is founded on these two, is that purpose is deliberately excluded by science. Here's a quote from the Nobel Prize winner Jacques Monod, who wrote a book called Cancer Necessity quite a while ago. He says, "The cornerstone of the scientific method is the postulate that nature is objective. In other words, the systematic denial that true knowledge can be got at by interpreting phenomena in terms of final causes, that is to say, of purpose." Now, I like this quote for two reasons. The first reason I like this quote is that it's a classic example of implicit scientism. So what you see is he goes from the first statement, where he's talking about the scientific method, and in the second sentence, he's saying, in other words, the systematic denial that true knowledge can be found. So in other words, he's identifying science with true knowledge. So it's a kind of implicit scientism. It's not explicit, but it's very clearly present if you just step back and see it. So I like it because it's a clear characterization, a clear example of scientism. But I actually think he's right if we just narrow the field, not to all knowledge, but to the question of science. Science does insist upon reproducibility and clarity, and those things pretty much exclude the possibility of describing things in terms of free agency. And science does proceed by explicitly sort of ruling out the question of final causes. So modern science, as we've known it since the scientific revolution, basically rules out personality and thereby purpose right from the get-go, from the beginning. It's just not part of its purview. So there can, in a certain sense, never be a scientific description of personality and purpose. We must look for those in terms that are non-scientific or super-scientific, I might suggest. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. Now, those of you who are in the academy particularly will realize that in the last 30 years or so, in universities, there's been a very strong reaction from people in the humanities fields in particular, philosophy and literature, to the pretended monopoly of knowledge that scientism has tended to portray. And this, in short, is referred to as being postmodernism. So one aspect of postmodernism is a rejection of science. Postmodern critiques of science are aimed at bringing science down to size. But I'd like to suggest to you that critique isn't so much a critique of science as it is a critique of scientism. But here's an example. Jean-François Lyotard is often considered to be kind of founder figure in postmodernism. Here's what he said. Scientific knowledge doesn't represent the totality of knowledge. So in other words, he's explicitly contradicting scientism. It's always existed in addition to and in competition and conflict with another kind of knowledge, which I'll call narrative. Or he simply says knowledge is not the same thing as science. So actually what's happened, those of you who are scientists realize that this critique has been out there for a few decades. What I would say is that many academics, particularly in the non-scientific disciplines, have joined in this rejection of scientism. And they've done so, I would argue, rightly. It's a justified reaction in a certain sense to scientism's pretended monopoly of knowledge. But the difficulty is that this is often taken to extremes. And so, as a result, it's not just scientism that is often rejected by postmodernists, it's science itself. And science's own expertise in its understanding of nature is often critiqued by the postmodernists. And they speak as if science hasn't really got any special knowledge, and that's their position. They want to cut science down to size. And this has a tendency to provoke what used to be called science wars, which have damped down a little bit over the last 10 years, perhaps, but were a very strong argument in academia in the late 20th century. So the problem with postmodernism is, in a certain sense, it throws out the baby, science, with the bathwater, scientism. But I would say that's not necessary. One doesn't have to adopt that viewpoint in order to reject scientism, provided you draw a distinction between science and scientism. So scientism is not just science, it's an improper extrapolation of science to the point where it becomes a worldview, an unproven worldview. So worldviews are things that usually have a justifying narrative history, an integrating cosmology, a kind of interpretive lens or filter through which the world is viewed and interpreted. It often has a community of believers, and they look to this worldview as a source of ethics. And I'd like to suggest that these are actually the characteristics of a religion. These are things you often point to in a religion. Now, if you're alert, you realize I've spent the first part of my talk talking about the integrating cosmology and the interpretive lens or filter that scientism has. I'm trying to explain to you the distinction between that and science itself. I want to spend just a few moments on these other bullets, talk about the narrative history and the community of believers. So scientism's justifying narrative is perhaps represented most characteristically by a story of Galileo and his interactions with the Roman Curia and with the Roman Inquisition. And this justifying narrative of scientism paints a picture that science and religion, and indeed all other authorities, have been permanently at war. And the portrayal is of an enlightening science winning a heroic battle against those entrenched, typically religious, power structures. I don't have time to go through this painting in all detail, but I'll just simply say that if you look carefully at this painting, you will get the impression that most of the light in this picture comes from the head of Galileo. In other words, he's got practically a halo here. So here is the heroic saint of science illuminating the dark and dreary religious authorities. And so this painting kind of captures that justifying narrative that scientism puts forward. But the interesting thing about this painting is actually its date. 1857. This painting doesn't come from Galileo's day. No, this is reading back into history the position of those who in the mid-19th century were fighting a battle, a part of academia's battle, to overthrow religious authority in higher education, in universities. And it was actually, that was the ethos that gave rise to this picture of Galileo. And the facts of what really happened to Galileo are very different. So scientism actually was a very important strategic vision in that 19th century struggle. And it was held up as a kind of Enlightenment objective, which of course, as we recognize, was essentially successfully achieved. I mean, the universities were in general secularized starting at about this time. So scientism has a justifying narrative. What about the religious community? Positivism was a type of scientism which is associated with the name most definitely of Auguste Comte. He had this scientific vision that all of knowledge must eventually be turned into science. This was a scientistic vision, and he saw himself as being the midwife of that transformation or that rebirth for the discipline of sociology. Now, the interesting thing about Kant and about Saint-Simon before him, another French positivist, was that they eventually turned their philosophical teachings into a religion. So Kant developed what he called the religion of humanity, and he put it forth with the following kinds of religious trappings. It had a hierarchical priesthood. Of course, he was the high priest. It had public services of commemoration, so people would meet regularly on the Sabbath. It had daily prayers. There were 9 personal sacraments. There were 81 annual festivals. And so it had all of the trappings of organized religion. This is, by the way, a positivist temple that's still standing in Brazil. And there were others even in Britain. So this particular scientific movement had indeed all of the trappings of a religion, including a community of believers. What about the ethical guidance that people look for? Well, ethics is something that's been attempted to be derived, particularly from social Darwinism, for 150 years. So this is the purpose. This is the idea of trying to derive purposes, values, meanings, and ethics scientifically. I won't spend any time on Herbert Spencer, but he became amazingly famous in America for his social Darwinistic arguments, whereby he argued that because the Darwin's processes depend on the survival of the fittest, one required, therefore, to let that work itself out, and work itself out, for example, in the economy. So he would advocate laissez-faire capitalism. That's probably the reason why people like Andrew Carnegie became great fans of his, because it was a way of justifying the fact that they were the survivors in the capitalist economy, and that was just the nature of things. But maybe some more thought should be put into eugenics, which grew up much more slowly than Spencer's meteoric rise and eventual fall. But it acquired a very wide support throughout the Europe and America. It was never uncontroversial. There were those who stood against it, but it could reach the stage where, for example, a Supreme Court justice could write that it is better for the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for a crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. This wasn't some crazy redneck. This was one of the best-known Supreme Court justices of the United States. So this was not just a sideline. It was mainstream thought for many people. Now, of course, the civilized world recoiled in horror when they saw what eugenics could lead to in terms of the Nazi Holocaust. And there was, of course, a very salutary recoil from that. But it wasn't too long before these efforts to derive morality scientifically got back into business. And sociobiology is one example. E.O. Wilson's book on sociobiology came out in 1975, and in it he was essentially applying analogies from social insects to human. And this was backed up by evolutionary explanations, rather speculative explanations. Actually, it's interesting that when E.O. Wilson published these books, he was really fiercely criticized by his scientific colleagues from Harvard, who said that, biological evidence of use had little relevance to human behavior. Thankfully, his conclusions were rather opposite of the eugenicists. So actually he said that no, that we shouldn't stamp out diversity, we should preserve diversity within the human genome, because that was his opinion. But the problem is he had no scientific reason to do so. There isn't any real scientific reason to conclude with the eugenicists or with the sociobiologists. And these, despite these strong criticisms from his scientific colleagues, these ideas still have an amazing hold on many in academia today. In fact, evolutionary psychology is part of the same trend. Now, of course, there's been tremendous progress in measuring, for example, physical signals in the brain and doing brain imaging and so on and so forth. But none of that really justifies the kind of old Freudian, very often, or other evolutionary just-so stories that the evolutionary psychologists so often put forward. The problem with all of these is that these arguments can be twisted to support practically any position that you happen to favor. And they don't really give us sound ethics. So I want to give you my answer to the question, how much faith should we put in science, and then say a few words more specifically about Christian belief. Natural science, I think, is indeed preeminent in its understanding of the ways in which the world shows reproducibility and clarity. And it is reasonable, in my view, to trust science preeminently in these questions of nature. That's what I mean by nature, is those things. But by the way, even that decision requires an assessment that goes beyond science itself. In other words, science can't pull itself up by its bootstraps. But it's not reasonable to view science as all the real knowledge there is. And it's not reasonable to insist that science's methods have to apply to all of academic study, let alone all of life itself. So the important point that I want to make here is that religion is not a special case. There are many other disciplines to which science doesn't apply. And so it's not simply that religion or Christianity is asking to be given special excuse from being rational, whereas the rest of the academic world adopts the methods of science. They don't and they shouldn't. To go beyond a reasonable trust to this, what I would regard as an unreasonable faith in scientism, is to make a religion, not a religious commitment, not a scientific commitment. So I would summarize by saying that yes, scientism and Christianity are incompatible, and the reason is basically because scientism is a rival worldview, or I would even go so far as to suggest a rival religion. But scientism and a lot of other non-scientific disciplines are also incompatible. So religion isn't a special case. And I believe that science and Christianity are not incompatible, although they may, well, on occasions, act in a kind of method of mutual correction and constraint. And the way that we can develop a viable and helpful relationship between science and Christianity is to distinguish science from scientism. Because once we make that distinction, we recognize that both scientific and non-scientific descriptions of a particular phenomenon or a particular aspect of the world can simultaneously be valid. And I'd like to say that this is not a new idea. This is not a reaction on the part of religious believers to try to find a way of making sense of the world that allows them their religious belief. Far from it. It's the way that the Bible has always regarded the things of nature. That they have, in a certain sense, a natural description, but in many cases they also have a description which is spiritual. So scientific and non-scientific descriptions can simultaneously be valid. Similarly, this outlook was historically important, and it was part of what our forebears meant when they talked about the revelation of God being in the form of two books, the book of nature and the book of God's work, and the book of God's word, which is the Bible. And finally, it's philosophically necessary because many non-scientific disciplines require us to regard as a possibility that scientific and non-scientific descriptions can simultaneously be valid. That's part of the way they operate. There are some true contrasts, I'd like to suggest, between science and the secular worldview that goes with scientism and the Christian worldview. I think it's fair to say that a starting presumption in much of the intellectual West today is that there is no reality deeper than what natural science discovers, and that there is no good higher than the freedom of the individual. Now, Christianity has a different view. Christianity believes that both the deepest reality and the highest moral good or authority are to be found in loving relationships. We Christians believe that the world exists because a God whose nature is love, expressed in relationship, has made it and loves it. And we believe that individuals are loved by God and find their true fulfillment in entering willingly into a relationship with God, and a loving relationship with one another. Now, we look around us and we see that all is not love. There's a great deal of pain and alienation and suffering, strife and war. But Christians believe that God has entered into the experience of his creatures in the person of a human, Jesus, and that he has somehow taken upon himself that alienation and suffering, and at enormous cost, overcome it. And we believe that this stupendous redeeming act took place in history, in a small country in the Middle East, and that it reverberates up and down the centuries. Now that worldview, that Christian worldview, is not a scientific worldview, but that doesn't mean that it's irrational, or that that it's incapable of being rationally discussed and thought about. Indeed, there are many reasons why we should take seriously Christianity and the existence of God. In fact, there are many different types of reasons to believe in God. There are classical philosophical arguments. There is evidence, to which I'll come back in a moment. There is immediate individual experience. There is a sense of organizing or ordering coherence within the religious worldview. And there are simple arguments of utility. I won't go into expanding on those. But even if we just take one of those types of arguments, or one of those types of reasons, just focusing on the question of evidence, the sorts of evidence that one would expect to give and to find for Christianity is not so much scientific evidence as historical or forensic evidence. And that's because of the nature of the claims of Christianity. So if one thinks about the question, if science isn't the only way to find out the truth of science, it certainly isn't the way to discover the reality of the claims of Christ, how do we discover? Well, I'd like to suggest it's kind of common sense. You use a primary documents. Use your intelligence. But what's very, very important, I think, is not to start with presuppositions that already entail the answer to the key questions. So if you start with scientism, if you start with the underlying belief that science is all the real knowledge there is, then you're not going to get very far. If you start with the belief that miracles simply don't happen, then you're going to have a certain view of, if you read the New Testament, of the plausibility. But I would submit that that's a situation where you've already assumed the answer. The flip side is that if you want to approach the claims of Christianity with an open mind, you probably don't want to start by saying, well, you have to believe that the Bible is inspired by God and all true, because that's, again, assuming the answer. I don't mean to say that we Christians don't regard the Bible as inspired. We do. But I'm saying that the Scriptures can perfectly well be studied without making that assumption from the get-go. Focus on Jesus Christ, I'd like to suggest, because after all, Christianity